Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Brazilian counterpart, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, pledged stronger BRICS and Global South cooperation in phone talks. Meanwhile, Lula has criticized the latest round of U.S. tariffs in the Washington Post, calling the move unfair and a strategic mistake. And shares of China's chipmaker Changxin Technology Group surged nearly 500% in its blockbuster debut on the Shanghai stock market. Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva have pledged to deepen bilateral cooperation and bring greater stability to an increasingly turbulent world. During a phone conversation held on Monday, Xi Jinping said China and Brazil, as major members of the Global South, should work together to improve global governance, uphold fairness and justice, and strengthen cooperation within BRICS. Lula said bilateral relations have continued to grow, with the two-way trade reaching a new high and cooperation expanding across a wide range of sectors. He expressed hope for closer collaboration with China in artificial intelligence, energy and mining, and welcomed more Chinese investment in Brazil. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Cao Ting, Director of Center for Latin American Studies of Fudan University. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you for the invitation.
Professor, let's start with the timing of this call. It comes as the U.S. is expanding unilateral tariffs, global trade is facing growing uncertainty, and BRICS is entering a new phase after expansion. So how should we understand the significance of this conversation under such a background? And has China-Brazil cooperation become even more important in today's changing world?
Well, I think this conversation reflects China's vision to stand against unilateralism and also China's approach of deepening diversified diplomacy and pragmatic cooperation. We can see that the two presidents agreed on the need to uphold multilateralism and defend international fairness and justice. And President Lula expressed Brazil's readiness to work closely with China on multilateral issues. And the deepening of China-Brazil relations can bring some stability to the turbulent global landscape because China and Brazil both are important emerging countries in the world and also important members of BRICS. So strengthening the bilateral cooperation will not only facilitate the high-quality development of greater BRICS cooperation, but also help uphold multilateralism, reject power politics, and contribute more significantly to the reform and improvement of the global governance system.
Mm-hmm. Professor, trade and cooperation between China and Brazil keep hitting new records, even as U.S. tariffs are going up around the world. So what's driving this momentum? What tangible benefits does this bring to the real economies of both countries?
Well, first of all, we can see that our economies, the economy of China and the economy of Brazil just fit together perfectly because China needs lots of commodities to keep the industries running and meet consumer demand, while Brazil needs manufactured goods and also technology to move its own economy forward. So between China and Brazil, there is a natural match. And second, the U.S. tariff policies have actually given China-Brazil trade an unexpected boost because China started buying some soybeans from Brazil to make up for what it used to get from the U.S. And when Brazilian products such as coffee faced tariff pressure in the U.S. market, China opened its doors wider to Brazilian coffee and other products. But it's not just about traditional goods anymore. New areas like electric vehicles artificial intelligence, the digital economy, and green energy are becoming the next big things in bilateral trade relationship. China does not only import Brazil's raw materials, but also import some Brazilian agricultural products that have gone through some processing. So that's also helping Brazil move its exports towards greater variety and higher value.
Could you please elaborate more on this? As you said, President Lula didn't just talk about soybeans or other traditional commodities. Instead, he specifically highlighted AI, energy, and minerals and invited more Chinese investment. So going forward, how could this two reshape the structure of China-Brazil economic relations?
China has strong expertise in AI applications and industrialization, while Brazil has a large and growing digital market with a lot of opportunities in smart agriculture, logistics, smart cities, and fintech. So Chinese AI solutions can directly boost the efficiency and value in Brazil's traditional industries. And we know Brazil holds key minerals like lithium and rare earths. So these minerals are very important for EV batteries, semiconductors, chips, and wind turbines. So their importance is rising with the energy transition and the AI boom. And so the cooperation between China and Brazil is shifting from Brazil mines, China imports, to the integration of the extraction, processing, manufacturing chain. So this kind of cooperation will bring China and Brazil closer together, and it's true a win-win cooperation for both sides.
More precise on the AI sector, Lula also voiced the support for China's vision of a more open and inclusive AI governance. At a time when we are seeing growing technology restrictions and AI competition elsewhere, in your opinion, could China and Brazil work together, to build a different model of AI cooperation for developing countries?
Yeah, I think so, because China's AI cooperation is built on fairness, inclusiveness, and shared gains. So that's exactly why Latin American countries see it as an option for diversifying where they get their technology and protecting their digital sovereignty. And China and Brazil are trying to explore a new path for the global south in digital cooperation, which is built on openness, equality, and sharing. This is about giving countries in the global south a way to reduce their reliance on other countries so they can truly take charge of their own development in the digital area.
Professor, both leaders also talked about taking BRICS cooperation to the next level. With the U.S. increasingly using tariffs and economic pressure, in your opinion, how can BRICS become a stronger platform for developing countries, to work together instead of being divided?
Well, China and Brazil share consensus among the global south through the BRICS mechanism, and both countries oppose power politics and unilateralism. This furnishes a more foundation and consensus for action for global south countries to jointly fend off external pressure in trade, finance, and other fields. And President Xi has put forward a vision to build a peaceful, innovative, green, just, and people-to-people BRICS. So it's also steering the direction of the cooperation. And these initiatives and pragmatic measures will help deliver more tangible outcomes, enable the global south to better coordinate positions and speak with a united voice on the BRICS platform.
One thing both leaders agree on is that countries should be able to make their own choices without outside interference. Brazil's government even denied visas to U.S. officials over concerns that they could interfere in its upcoming elections. Professor, how important is this message, especially for Latin America and the broader global south?
Well, we know that the United States has manipulated elections and political power shifts across Latin American countries for more than a century by funding opposition factions, launching smear campaigns, interfering in judicial affairs, and even instigating military coups. And as the largest country in Latin America, Brazil has taken a tough stance by refusing visas to U.S. diplomats. I think this demonstrates that major developing countries are capable of safeguarding their electoral sovereignty through legitimate diplomatic channels and can set a practical countermeasure model for other Latin American countries.
Thanks, Professor, for those valuable insights. That was Professor Cao Ting, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies of Fudan University. Coming up, Lula has criticized the latest round of U.S. tariffs in the Washington Post, calling the move unfair and a strategic mistake. This is World Today. Stay with us.
Welcome. I'm Elaf Ellard, economics professor and member of the Data Science and AI Center at New York University, Shanghai. On the World Today program, you can find in-depth and impartial insight, as well as critical commentary on key trends in the Chinese economy, financial technology, business, and blockchain. To prepare for the world tomorrow, join me on World Today.
You've been listening to World Today. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has denounced the latest U.S. tariffs as unfair and a strategic mistake, warning that they would harm bilateral partnership and drive up costs for U.S. consumers. In an opinion piece published by the Washington Post, Lula said the tariffs would also disrupt deeply integrated supply chains over the longer term, prompting Brazilian companies to replace U.S. suppliers with partners elsewhere. The United States has imposed tariffs of up to 12.5% on imports from Brazil and dozens of other economies, citing allegations of forced labor. The measures took effect last Friday as part of the Trump administration's broader tariff agenda. So to delve into this, joining us on the line is Joseph Mahoney, professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor, President Lula didn't just criticize the new U.S. tariffs at home. He took his message straight to the American public by writing in the Washington Post. He called the tariffs unfair and a strategic mistake. What's striking that we know the U.S. has actually enjoyed a trade surplus with Brazil for the past 15 years, but Brazil is still facing one of Washington's highest tariff rates. How do you interpret Lula's decision, to challenge U.S. tariff policy directly in the American public sphere?
By going to a premier U.S. newspaper, Lula bypasses Trump and appeals to American businesses, consumers, and policymakers. He effectively argues the tariffs will raise prices on food, footwear, textiles, furniture, and auto parts for U.S. consumers. He highlights the U.S. has maintained, as you noted, a trade surplus with Brazil, totaling $428 billion over 15 years, and frames the tariffs as not just unfair, but economically nonsensical. He also explicitly accuses Trump of interfering in Brazilian politics ahead of the October election. Now, the op-ed was published the day after Flavio Bolsonaro, who's Trump's ally, launched his presidential campaign in Brazil. Now, Lula warns that Brazilian companies will replace U.S. suppliers with partners elsewhere, a threat to shift trade towards China and the EU, where Brazil's trade grew 15.9% and 6.1% respectively in the first half of this year alone. So in short, Lula is fighting back on American turf, exposing the tariffs as politically driven rather than economically justified, and signaling that Brazil has alternatives.
But Washington says these new tariffs are about tackling so-called forced labor, although they don't. These measures apply broadly across different economies without publicly presenting country-specific evidence. So in your opinion, how credible are those allegations from the U.S., and how do you assess this increasingly generalized and instrumental use of tariffs in U.S. trade policy today?
Well, I'm going to avoid the topic of the abuse of prison labor in the United States itself, and say, so let's not get hung up on the double standard, which is always existing in U.S. policymaking. But in terms of this, how he's applying this policy, it's textbook instrumentalization. By imposing a blanket tariff across 60 countries without presenting specific evidence, Trump isn't really tackling forced labor. He's weaponizing the accusation to gain maximum leverage. Now, the lack of differentiation is intentional. It creates sweeping uncertainty, trying to force every nation to negotiate bilaterally. Again, in short, he's not giving evidence that others have done wrong to justify the tariffs as is required. Instead, he's trying to force others to prove that they haven't done wrong.
More about this legal basis of this move. What's very interesting is that Washington has changed the legal basis for this tariffs 3 times in just 6 months. In February this year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Trump could not rely on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose broad global tariffs. And Washington then shifted to Section 122 of the Trade Act of the 1974 to introduce temporary tariffs. And then after those measures expired in July, he invoked Section 301 under the justification of labor-related concerns to maintain the tariff agenda. So every time one legal avenue ran into problems, another seemed to appear, right? What does this tell us about the legal controversies surrounding the implementation of U.S. tariffs policies domestically?
Well, it reveals a deeply strained and opportunistic legal foundation. Within 6 months, the administration has played musical chairs with statutes. First, as you noted, IEEPA struck down, then Section 122 expired, now Section 301. So the core controversy is that tariffs have become a policy goal in themselves, not a legal remedy. Section 301, requires formal investigations and country-specific evidence. Yet, by applying it broadly to 60 nations retroactively under a labor rationale, it is a significant legal stretch. In fact, I don't think it holds legal merit. Now, it invites near certain WTO challenges, but of course, the problem is that the U.S. has been able to block the appellate body of that organization.
Lula says American consumer will end up paying the price and that businesses on both sides will suffer. But supporters of tariffs argue that they generate revenue for the United States, also for the government in the short term, creating incentives for Washington to, maintain or even expand them. What's your take on those arguments? Could the short-term gains end up creating much bigger long-term costs for the American economy?
Well, economically, Lula is correct. The projected $179 billion in tariff revenue is dwarfed by the long-term cost, estimated GDP drag of up to 1% annually, supply chain friction, and higher consumer prices hitting swing voters. On a pure cost-benefit, short-term gains, on pure cost-benefit, short-term gains do not outweigh the long-term damage. However, Washington's calculus is not primarily economic. It's political and it's preemptive. The revenue is a convenient bonus, but the real logic is leveraging the dollar's remaining dominance to force a global supply chain reset now before de-dollarization reaches a tipping point. Now, domestically, there's also political consideration. So maintaining tariffs disciplines the Republican Party ahead of midterms. Loyalty to Trump becomes the price of protecting local industries. The legal workarounds signal, as he always does, that he never backs down. This is something that the base likes, his base. But also, there's an international component. Geopolitically, targeting Brazil punishes Lula for his independent foreign policy and sends a direct warning to Argentina if voters shift away from Milei's reforms there in Argentina, which are deeply unpopular right now. And Milei is an ally of Trump. They may face similar treatment down the road. So on the balance sheet, no, it fails economically. But as a political and preemptive power play, the administration sees the short-term revenue as sufficient cover to justify the broader strategic disruption.
Professor, let's shift to another development related to tariffs. Bloomberg report that Washington is pressuring Mexico to join its tariff campaign against Chinese steel and aluminum, trying to, close another route for Chinese products into the U.S. market. How do you interpret this effort to, force allies and partners to participate in coordinated trade restrictions? And from China's perspective, how concerning is this development?
Well, it's a significant strategic escalation. Washington is using the USMCA review as leverage to pressure Mexico into adopting equivalent Section 232 tariffs, a common external barrier against China. So currently, the U.S. applies a 50% tariff on Chinese steel, while Mexico's is up to 25%. Now, for China, this is deeply concerning for several reasons. Here are two of them. First, it threatens its largest export transshipment hub. And second, it again signals an American effort to build a coalition of anti-China tariff allies. So in short, the U.S. is trying to build a fortress North America to lock out China and anyone else who challenges U.S. hegemony.
The new U.S. tariffs will also affect China. How should China respond?
Well, I think what we see already is this very positive call between President Lula and President Xi. And we have seen throughout the different stages, we should say this is nothing new. Trump really lacks other a more creative means to sort of try to implement a foreign policy. And he's so deeply invested in this message politically that he can't abandon it at this point. And it is the way he's disciplining his own party. By the way, the Republican Party isn't the Congress members are not Republican Congress members are not that worried yet about November. They're worried about the primaries, where Trump can hurt them if they're not loyal. So this is a power play that has that sort of shorter term interest. But, China has found ways to break out of these constraints already in multiple fronts. And that includes working with countries like Brazil, but also other partners in BRICS, SCO, working more closely with ASEAN nations. I don't think that this is a strategy that will work for the United States. It hasn't worked thus far. It's only caused more problems for the U.S.
Lula says Latin America doesn't need punishment. It needs reliable trading partners. Then, in your opinion, what options do other economies and developing countries actually have? And how can cooperation among, especially those emerging economies, help offset the impact of growing protectionism today?
Well, emerging markets have three clear pathways. First, deepen South-South trade. Brazil's strategy is instructive. Trade with China grew 15.9% in early 2026. And as I noted earlier, and again, the EU up to 6.1%. Diversifying export destinations reduces reliance on the U.S. market. Second, we need to continue to build alternative payment systems. BRICS, Inbridge, and China's CIPS are maturing, reducing exposure to dollar-denominated sanctions and tariffs. The more trade settle in local currencies, the less effective U.S. tariffs become. And third, strengthen regional value chains. ASEAN, Mercosur, and the African Continental Free Trade Area offer frameworks to keep goods moving without U.S. intermediation.
Thanks, Professor, for those insightful analysis. That was Dr. Joseph Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. More to come. Shares of China's chipmaker Changxin Technology Group surged around 500% in its blockbuster debut on the Shanghai stock market. China's industrial profits extend strong growth in the first half. U.S. President Donald Trump has paused airstrikes on Iran after nearly 2 weeks of bombing over the Strait of Hormuz. You are listening to World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. We'll take a short break. Coming back, we'll continue our discussion. You've been listening to World Today with Mika Anna in Beijing. China's leading memory chip maker Changxin Memory Technologies, or CXMT, has had a blockbuster debut on Shanghai stock market. The stock surged around 500%, pushing the company's market value to 3.6 trillion yuan, or roughly $500 billion, overtaking Chinese banking giant ICBC and U.S. chip giant Intel. The listing is reportedly the largest IPO on the stock market and Asia's biggest so far this year. CXMT, the world's fourth largest producer of dynamic random access memory, and is developing high bandwidth memory for AI data centers. For more on this, Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, a professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, China's Changxin Memory Technologies get listed on the Shanghai stock market. From your perspective, why is this IPO such an important milestone, not just for the company itself, but for China's semiconductor industry as a whole?
Well, because I think this IPO shows that the Changxin Memory Technology is China's leading the so-called dynamic random access memory, or DRAM, manufacturer. It is highly technological demanding and capital intensive. So now with Changxin's listing, it shows that it secures massive capital through public market to help China to build its own DRAM. So I think for the company, it is an important milestone as it's a relatively young company founded in 2016. So this is important as is IPO. But at the same time, I think it really symbolizes that China is making very significant progress and position itself from a standard technology follower to an active global competitor. It is able to now utilize the capital market to continue to support its DRAM manufacturing, and it helped to secure the local supply chain resilience. So I think this is a both important milestone for the company and for China as a whole.
And where would you place Changxin today in the global memory chip industry?
Well, I think, first of all, we know this is a company that is ranked first overall in China. And second, with this IPO, the post-market valuation puts the company's capital market to the capital value to close to 580 billion yuan. And now it is the fourth largest DRAM manufacturer in the global market. It is now captured around 7.7% of global share based on the late 2025 vendor sales data. So overall, I think this is really a tech giant, and it's one of the largest DRAM manufacturer in China. That said, Changxin's own prospectus acknowledge that its production capacity remains insufficient to fully meet China's vast domestic market demand, and it still trails behind the world's top three legacy manufacturers. But again, I think this still shows a significant progress in a short amount of time in Changxin's capability. And now with the market access in Shanghai, the largest capital market in China and the second largest in the world, I think that Changxin is having a great potential to really quickly invest in this technology, in its manufacturing capability, and to catch up with the top three in the world.
And when people talk about AI, the spotlight usually falls on GPUs and the advanced processors. But increasingly, experts are saying that memory chips could become just as important. So why is DRAM becoming such a critical technology in the AI era?
Well, because I think the high performance memory chips like the DRAM is now really the AI bottleneck. Because even though the GPU help to process the AI algorithms, these memory chips are necessary to feed vast amount of data into the processors without causing computational bottlenecks. And so the surge in AI servers and the data centers create a massive demand for these rapid data transfer speeds, and therefore the demand for these high performance memory chips. So this is a really structural factor, but there's also some kind of more transitory factors, because these DRAM had a limited supply during the COVID era and after the COVID. And now with the AI boom, all of a sudden there's a much higher demand met with this relatively limited supply. So that's why you're seeing now a lot of attention is put on these kinds of memory chips. And so many of the companies dominant in this era, like Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, the top three, they're seeing their sales revenues, their profits, the capital market really surged in recent months. So I think there's a very strong industry upcycle that is driven by the AI compute demand, have now kicked off a new global restructuring. And now investment is really focusing on the entire semiconductor supply chain, especially with the bottleneck, which is these DRAM chips.
And China has invested heavily in building its semiconductor ecosystem over the past several years. And looking at the industry today, how would you assess its overall progress?
Well, I think China is progressing very quickly, especially under the restraint from the external pressure. As we know, the United States is restricting some of the high-end chips exports to China and rally the allies to restrict some of the chip-making machinery to China. So with this kind of pressure, I think ironically, it really spurred China's motivations and mobilization of social resources and pretty much rally around the government, the companies, the professional talents, and all the downward stream industries to develop and manufacturing its semiconductor chips, and among other AI infrastructures such as electricities, and all these 5G network. So I think China is positioning itself really as a leading country in this AI developments, and we're now seeing a lot of the movements from purely software investments to now infrastructure capabilities. And again, China has a lot of advantages in there. Because it's large manufacturing capacity and increasing technological advancements. So now China is building, I think, complete the kinds of physical industrial chain, including semiconductors, memory chips, advanced computing powers, energies, and also end-use hardware. So these embodied AI products. So I think that help companies now are able to realize that AI scaling is really dependent on these underlying hardware availability. So that's what is giving China a lot of advantages. When you look at China's export, for example, it exported 279.8 billion integrated circuit in the first half of this year. And that's a 23% jump. So I think that really is a testament to China's rapid growth in the memory chips and other integrated circuit hardware. And not to mention, I think with now, DeepSeek and Kimi, K3, and many other large language models, we're seeing China is advancing in these LLMs. And last but not the least, I think China is also very quickly integrating AI technologies in the rest of the economy and producing, or going to produce over 100,000 robotics by the end of this year. So all of this shows is a very well-rounded, holistic development in the entire AI supply chain.
And the global DRAM market has been dominated by Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. So looking ahead, do you think Chinese companies like Changxin can capture meaningful global market share?
Yes, I think the Chinese firms are positioned to secure a larger sustainable share of the global market over the next 10 or coming decades. I think that this is due to a few factors. One is there is a very rapid domestic adoption. As I mentioned earlier, there is a constraint from the imports of these high-end chips. There's also increasing technological advancements. So these domestically made chips are actually very well accepted. Then there's also the expansion of manufacturing capabilities. And now with the capital market access, all of this means that players like the Changxin and also YMTC, whose NAND flash market share now recently rose to 13%. So companies like these, they are leveraging the AI restructuring window that really, look into and investing in the hardware. They are actively break into the traditional market hierarchy. So I think it is optimistic that the Chinese firms again, leveraging on their large market, their manufacturing capability, and the technological breakthroughs, are going to gain a lot more meaningful market shares in the coming years and decades.
That's Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University, speaking with Zhao Yang. China's industrial profits maintained a strong growth in the first half of the year. Profits at major industrial firms rose nearly 19% from a year earlier to around 4 trillion yuan, or over $540 billion. The mining sector led the gains, with profits up by 1/3, while manufacturing profits increased 20%. For this and more, let's have Professor Liu Baocheng, Director of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Okay, thank you for the invitation.
Professor, China's industrial profits jumped nearly 19% in the first half, with growth accelerating from the first quarter. How do you interpret the resilience of China's industrial sector amid a challenging global economic environment, and what factors are driving this stronger than expected performance?
Such a strong profit growth of the Chinese industrial sector demonstrates that the real economy is showing considerable resilience despite some of the challenges both at home and abroad. There are several factors I can identify behind such a good performance. First, China's manufacturing foundation remains highly competitive, with more of the comprehensive economic and industrial cluster that supports a stronger production capacity, and also with a broader ecosystem that can have spillover effect on the rest of the regions. So this allows enterprises to respond very quickly to both domestic and international market changes and maintain such sort of efficiency. And second, industrial upgrading is really generating the new growth momentum because the improvement is not simply driven by the enlarging manufacturing capacity, but rather by innovation-intensive sectors such as the high-tech manufacture, equipment, and also the green industries. So the companies are really moving from competing merely on cost and on scale towards more on technology and quality. So lastly, I think the domestic policy support has also strengthened the business environment, because a number of measures are there to boost the domestic demand and promote the technological innovation and support more of the hidden champions to grow in size in the private sector. So these are there to combine to support such a strong recovery of the Chinese industrial productivities.
Professor, the electronics industry was among the biggest contributors to the industrial profit growth, with AI adoption driving strong demand for computing power. Profits in sectors such as computer manufacturing and integrated circuits saw a significant increase. How's the global surge in computing demand translating into growth across China's entire electronic supply chain? And how do you look at the sustainability of this growth model over the long term?
The global AI boom is creating new opportunities for companies and for countries who are ready for it, because it is there to form a new industrial cycle around the computing power, and China's electronic industry is benefiting from such a trend, and this trend is really something that's really sustainable and part to the future. Along the entire supply chain, China is really firmly positioned in many parts of the streams. In the upper stream level, the demand for semiconductor, advanced components, power management system, in which China can also provide, particularly for the global south. At the midstream level, manufacturers such as servers, intelligent devices, and industrial equipments also expanding their production. At the downstream level, which is China is best at, is that more of the AI applications are creating the new markets in both manufacture, logistics, healthcare, and finance, and also consumer services. So China's advantage is not limited to a single line of product. It has developed one of the most comprehensive electronic ecosystem covering the chip design, manufacturing, packaging, components, and also after-sales service. So this really helps China to grow on a sustainable basis with both domestic application and also international market expansion.
Professor, China's growth story has evolved over time. First came the traditional old three products such as clothing and home appliances, then to the new three represented by electric vehicles, solar, and batteries. Now we are seeing a new wave driven by AI, industrial robots, and innovative medicine. So how do you view the new three? How will it further boost China's economy going forward?
I think, first of all, the new three represents the important areas of future economic growth opportunities and also benefit for people's livelihood at large. And their development needs to be understood with more confidence and also caution. China has really accumulated significant advantage in manufacturing, engineering talent, digital infrastructure, and also building more of application scenarios. So these strengths provide a strong foundation for industries such as artificial intelligence, industrial robots, and innovative medicine. But I must caution that unlike the previous wave of industrial upgrading, so these new industries face more complex competitive environment, not to mention certain sanctions China has faced, and it takes more time for China to be highly innovative in the upper stream, particularly in the research area, because this area is facing more of the challenges to discover new areas and new utilities in the airground. So therefore, the key question is not really simply whether China can develop this industry, but whether it can really create companies with genuine technology advantages and sustainable businesses, so that we will be able to prevent a certain scenario, another type of intense competition with homogeneous productions.
Professor, one last question. It's not just chips and future or AI-related industries doing well. We see traditional sectors like mining, metals, and chemicals are also seeing strong growth. How should we understand the surge of traditional industries? What does this mean for the broader real economy?
Well, I think they go along together instead of pushing each other away, because the simultaneous improvement of both of the emerging and traditional industries, they represent the holistic competitiveness of the Chinese industry. So new growth and traditional upgrading, they are happening together rather than replacing each other. Those emerging industries such as semiconductor, artificial intelligence, and also the advanced manufacturing, they represent the future growth engine, but they also depend on the traditional industries for materials, equipments, energy. So these are really there to support a sort of virtuous loop between traditional industries and emerging industries. And when China is now having such a large economy, we should be able to accommodate a large diversity where traditional industries, they can accommodate more of the job opportunities. So therefore, by introducing more of the modern and emerging technologies into the traditional industries, we're able to create more job opportunities and also to boost the industrial growth at the high level on a sustainable level.
Thanks, Professor, for those insightful observations. That was Professor Liu Baocheng, Director of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. U.S. President Donald Trump has paused airstrikes on Iran after nearly 2 weeks of bombing over the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. ambassador to the UN says Trump is giving diplomatic efforts some space. Iran says it halted retaliatory attacks after the U.S. stopped its airstrikes. Iran also confirmed that the United States is exchanging messages with Tehran through mediators, including Pakistan and Qatar. So for more about this, let's have my colleague Gao Yingshi joining us in the studio. Thanks for joining us, Yingshi.
Thanks for having me.
Yingshi, over nearly 2 weeks, we saw repeated rounds of U.S. airstrikes and Iranian retaliation. What was each side trying to achieve militarily over the past weeks?
So, on the U.S. side, the Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil. So, Washington framed its strikes as kind of restoring their principle that no single state can hold a global waterway. There's also another economic and also political stakes here. So, when the strait is closed, oil prices climb, and we've seen them push back above $100 a barrel. So, for the United States administration, that has like direct domestic consequences. Higher fuel and energy costs feed into inflation and quickly become a political liability at home, and it would harm the midterm performance. So the United States doubled down on strikes to open the strait before the economic and political cost mounted further. So that's also why we saw strikes on their coastal radar, also including air defense systems, missile sites, and also fast attack boats. So, but for Iran, the calculation was different. Tehran cannot match the United States in conventional firepower, so its strategy relies on asymmetry and deterrence. Iran signals that any pressure on its economy or territory carries a price. The retaliatory attacks were more about demonstrating resolve, both to Washington and to a domestic audience. So what's important is that neither side appeared to want a full-scale ground war. The United States simply lacks the ability or the will to occupy Iran, and also Iran knows a direct war would costly for themselves. So what we witnessed was like closer to kind of coercive bargaining through force, each side trying to shape the other's willingness to negotiate without going to a whole-scale war. The danger in this kind of conflict is definitely miscalculation when both sides are signaling through escalation. If a single misread happened, or maybe a ship sunk with casualties, can push events beyond anyone's control. The fact that it has reached a 13th consecutive night of strikes without turning into a no-out war suggests that both governments were managing this kind of escalation carefully, even as the rhetoric grow more and more heated. In the end, each side was trying to enter kind of negotiation from a position of strength.
Mm-hmm. President Trump has now paused the strikes and, in Washington's words, is giving diplomacy some space. What's your take? What pushed the U.S. to make such a decision, in your opinion?
So according to report, the post come after top U.S. military commander in the region advised the president to hold a campaign. They had told Trump that U.S. military campaign had reached its limits of effectiveness. The U.S. had nearly exhausted the list of targets it had developed to attack Iran, and without a return to a major combat operation, there was like little point in continuing the bombing campaign. So in other words, the strikes had largely accomplished what air power alone could accomplish, and continuing would just mean hitting kind of diminishing returns. But the deeper concern is definitely ammunition. This is where the limits of even the superpowers military become visible. They warned about like decreasing munition stockpiles, which include Patriot missile interceptors and offensive weapons like cruise missiles. The Patriot interceptors are especially significant because they are defensive, and the long-time strikes would overconsume the Patriot missile interceptors and other air defense munitions deployed in the Middle East. Even this kind of offensive strikes United States launched risks like provoking Iran retaliation, and like defending this kind of against this retaliation draws down the interceptors that are already in short supply. So the more United States escalate offensively, the more it depleted its defensive shield, exposing its own forces. the interceptor shortage may be just one consideration among several, but it's definitely a critical one. It also tells us like high intensity campaigns consume munitions faster than they can be replaced. There are also different voices within the United States government. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff also expressed concerns of the risks of a whole-scale war against Iran. Basically, the campaign had done what it could, and going further would only leave the United States forces in a weaker position.
Another piece of news related to this is that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu is paying another visit to Washington. What does he want to achieve through this visit, and how might it shape Washington's next moves?
So Israel's role here is really crucial. So for decades, Israel has viewed Iran as its most serious strategic threat. There are several objections. The first, definitely to shape the terms of any kind of potential agreement. Israel's deepest fear is a deal that poses the current fighting, but leaves Iran's longer-term capabilities, especially its nuclear infrastructure, intact. From Netanyahu's perspective, a diplomatic settlement that simply restores the status quo could allow Iran to rebuild and re-emerge stronger. So he may not like to see any kinds of agreement, just a ceasefire over the streets. And although the second objection is the coordination and reassurance. Israel wants to confirm that the United States post does not mean that Washington is stepping back from fighting Iran. Netanyahu may seek guarantees about intelligence sharing and military support. The real question here is how might this shape Washington's next move? So here we see that a central tension within the U.S. policy. On one hand, the current U.S. administration is trying to de-escalate and kind of preserve a kind of diplomatic track, but also on the other, it must manage a close ally who may favor a harder line. So if Netanyahu's success in hardening U.S. conditions, negotiation with Iran could just become more difficult because Tehran may see these terms as totally unacceptable. If Washington instead prioritizes reaching a deal, it risks friction with Israel.
Thanks, Yingshi, for those insights. That was my colleague Gao Yingshi. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. A quick recap of today's headlines. Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Brazilian counterpart Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva pledged stronger BRICS and Global South cooperation in phone talks. Lula has criticized the latest round of U.S. tariffs in the Washington Post, calling the move unfair and a strategic mistake. Shares of China's chipmaker Changxin Technology Group surged nearly 500% in its blockbuster debut on the Shanghai stock market. China's industrial profits extend a strong growth in the first half, and U.S. President Donald Trump has paused airstrikes on Iran after nearly 2 weeks of bombing over the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Anna in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.